is headed for civilizational collapse. You might think that's a hyperbolic statement, extreme, a bit provocative. Well, in 2024, in England and in Wales, the number one boy's name for babies was Mohammed. For baby girls, it was Olivia. What does that indicate to me, to everyone who's been following international headlines over the last few decades, is that mass migration into the United Kingdom has accelerated. And as a result, the makeup of that country has transformed. Now, remember that Great Britain is an island, so if it accepts millions of migrants, it is a conscious political choice. It's not that it has to absorb a lot of migrants from its neighbors. It doesn't have the border that we have with Mexico or to the north, Canada. It's an island. So if it did this voluntarily of its own accord. Some stats for you that are really interesting. This week, the United Kingdom's Office of National Statistics projected the population of England and Wales grew by 700,000 over the last 12 months, with 98% of that growth due to migration. Apparently, ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who is supposedly a conservative, helped open the floodgates to these migrants because he refused a hard annual cap on migration, despite campaigning on slashing those numbers. So he swore he was going to cut migration, and then once in office, he ended up doing the opposite. So you have the United Kingdom receiving an outrageous number of migrants from other countries, many of which are hostile to Western civilization. By comparison, the natural population growth, or the number of births compared to deaths, only accounted for an addition of 29,982 people to the population. So fewer Brits are having families, they are not procreating, but immigration is way up from a lot of these places in the Middle East and on the periphery of that. Here's what this professor had to say.
And I have to say, lots of people will scream at me online after this. The West and Western nations now need to start talking about family policy in terms of survival, not only tax incentives, but in terms of the survival of their nations.
Now, Professor Goodwin has also said that the incentives are not there for British families to have more children. There's not enough financial help. Maybe he's saying that they need a little bit of natalism in the United Kingdom. There's also not enough housing being built. So they have this sort of similar housing shortage and struggle that the United States has. But he produced a report last month which found that if current trends continue, the white British population will become a minority in their own country by 2063, and it would fall to just 22.7% by 2100. You might be thinking, okay, so what? The UK is just going to be more diverse, except the lack of cultural immersion here is the problem. It'd be one thing if this population was assimilating very well, but all signs point to that not being true. We now know that 40% of sexual assaults committed in London last year were by foreign nationals. And the data is also that Afghan men are 20 times more likely than British to be convicted of a sexual crime. Britain has imported so many sexual predators and violent criminals that they're clogging up the prison system. Of course, exorbitant cost to the taxpayer with that. And my question is, where are the feminists? When they're not railing against J.K. Rowling, who has very bravely stood up against transgender activism in the United Kingdom, saying that this is fundamentally incompatible with feminism, given that so many biological men are encroaching on hard-fought women's spaces, when the feminists aren't just absolutely raging against that beloved children's book author and others like her, they are really silent about the sexual abuse among women in the United Kingdom right now by some of these migrant men. And this isn't just an isolated incident here or there. There is documentation of widespread sexual terrorism in Great Britain. In January, there were reports of grooming gangs that were into the news. This is a phenomenon that unfortunately had been going on for years. It's like at least 10 years in the making, but it got renewed interest by national news and international news this past year. Now, this involves abhorrent sex crimes, and it's pretty graphic, but just to give you a sample, here are the sentencing remarks from a 2013 case in Oxford, UK. Mohammed Karar, he was in his 30s, anally raped an 11-year-old girl. When she became pregnant at age 15, he took her to receive an illegal abortion. He gave her drugs, including crack cocaine and heroin. It gets so much worse, so I'll spare you the details, but basically at one point there were multiple men who were involved in one sex act simultaneously on this poor child, and she had a ball in her mouth to prevent her from screaming. Our Abigail Anthony writes, Carrar treated that girl like cattle, branding his initial on her rear with a hot hairpin. Simply put, the grooming gangs are better characterized as torturous child prostitution rings that commit sexual terrorism. Now, I know I was just saying a lot of the feminists in England are mum's the word on this egregious scandal, absolute crime against humanity, but there have been some who have spoken out, and I applaud them for that. British feminist Julie Bindel published a well-investigated article in 2007 addressing this problem, and she said that groups of men who had been preying on young, vulnerable girls and ensnaring them into prostitution was something that should absolutely be of national interest. And she later stated that despite the evidence she had collected, it took until 2007 to publish an article on the topic because in this particular geographical area, many of the members of grooming gangs were of Pakistani origin, and some editors feared an accusation of racism. So this is DEI wokeness in the United Kingdom rearing its ugly head, preventing actual prosecution of disgusting crimes because of fear of offending or of being accused of bigotry. So the UK was very intentional then about suppressing talk of the scandal then, and the same thing is happening right now as mass migration continues to cause, quite frankly, a crisis for the United Kingdom. I also feel like I need to emphasize even more how big of a deal this is and what a tragedy that this was essentially not reported on for years until finally the UK government could not ignore it any longer. The Rotherham scandal began in 2010 when 5 men, all of whom have very Middle Eastern ethnic sounding names, were sentenced for sexual offenses against children, and everything escalated in 2012 when British journalist Andrew Norfolk published articles releasing evidence from hundreds of documents showing this widespread child sex exploitation in southern Yorkshire since 2000, particularly Rotherham. And one report dated in 2010 stated that police intelligence were aware that thousands of such crimes occurred every year, so they knew about this. But his report also found that, once again, police and social services were afraid to touch this. Why? Quote, there is a problem with networks of Asian offenders, both locally and nationally, reads an excerpt from one document. There appears to be a significant problem with networks of Asian males exploiting young white females. And a 2010 report for the Rotherham Safeguarding Children Board stated that the crimes had cultural characteristics which are locally sensitive in terms of diversity. The report continued, there are sensitivities of ethnicity with potential to endanger the harmony of community relationships. Great care will be taken in drafting this report to ensure that its findings embrace Rotherham's qualities of diversity. It is imperative that suggestions of a wider cultural phenomenon are avoided. So this is what happens when you make diversity the sacred cow of your culture. And this is when I say that Western civilization is committing suicide, or at the very minimum, committing acts of self-harm and self-flagellation, especially in places like the United Kingdom and other European countries as well. The ones who are bucking that trend are Poland and Hungary that have cut off mass migration and are actually trying to stand for not only national sovereignty, but their traditions and customs and morals that actually created Western civilization and made it the flourishing, beautiful society that it is. But the United Kingdom, you could argue, hates itself. Otherwise, why would you tolerate this kind of harm against your own citizens, including young girls, because they don't want to risk being offensive? And in the Rotherham case, I mean, we're talking pretty serious police misconduct as well, because they're probably following the cues of, what's coming from above, saying, hey, this is much ado about nothing. Don't make too much of a fuss about this. For example, a 13-year-old girl was found intoxicated in a house with Asian men after a neighbor reported hearing her scream. The police arrested the child for being drunk and disorderly, but didn't interrogate the men. I mean, can you imagine? And then there was something in 2014 called the J Report. This was a bombshell because it concluded that roughly 1,400 children, and apparently that was a conservative estimate, were sexually exploited in Rotherham from 1997 to 2013. So that entire large period, and it found cases of girls as young as 11 being gang raped, including one instance where a child was doused with petrol and threatened with being set on fire. In 2 cases, the fathers tried to remove their daughters from the houses where the abuse was occurring, yet the dads were arrested. The dads were arrested. Victims and their families often remain silent because of the perpetrators' leading intimidation campaigns, complete with stalking and threats. I mean, you really cannot make this stuff up. And once again, the same theme recurring, that those who are supposed to be the first responders, the ones who are cracking down on this crime, the ones that are ameliorating the situation for the victims, are too scared to act. Quote, several staff described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of perpetrators for fear of being thought racist. Others remembered clear direction from their managers not to do so, according to the report. So the UK has a serious, existential issue on their hands where they are literally condoning or turning a blind eye, in the worst cases, covering up pedophilia, sexual abuse, because of the ethnic identity of those who are the assailants. But the UK doesn't want to admit it has a problem, and despite all this, like I said, the British government is doing everything it can to suppress any dissent among its citizens about the consequences of all of this. The UK government considers belief in any form of cultural nationalism or concern about mass migration and a lack of integration to be on the same plane as white supremacy. They have a radicalization awareness course, which sheepishly admits that the greatest threat to the UK national security comes from Islamist terrorist recruiters. But they bend over backwards to play up far-right extremism as equally problematic. The moral equivalence there is jarring. There, unfortunately, is no competition. I think Great Britain needs to be a lot more concerned about the mass migration problem. Oh, and as of a few days ago, it looks like the UK police state is out in droves. An elite police squad apparently is going to monitor anti-migrant posts on social media. So you can expect that the police could come to your home if you criticize mass migration as a citizen of the United Kingdom. And judges are also probably going to give longer sentences for thinking that they determined to be wrong. And this is an assault on free speech, obviously, that should make all of us very grateful for the First Amendment here in the United States, a luxury which folks in Great Britain do not have. I mean, and just to show you how bad this is, rapists, pedophiles, and terror offenders have received shorter sentences than a mother who wrote a bad tweet that she took down. She served longer months in prison than those who committed those other horrible offenses. So things are looking bleak in the United Kingdom, and to me, this makes me think of what anarcho-tyranny is by definition. It's where the government is prosecuting petty crimes, thought crimes even, something straight out of a George Orwell novel, straight out of 1984, but they do not prosecute the worst kinds of crimes. Obviously, that is to the detriment of all law-abiding citizens in the United Kingdom. Our friends across the pond need a wake-up call desperately. I truly pity them. It makes me very sad. This is the place that birthed the Magna Carta, Winston Churchill, that fought alongside us during World War II against tyranny, against authoritarianism. Margaret Thatcher, a terrific prime minister, the Iron Lady who worked with our president, Ronald Reagan. We have an incredible friendship historically with this nation, but it has self-sabotaged itself because of its mass migration policies. And meanwhile, the rights for its citizens of free speech and free expression are withering away under the guise of tolerance and equity and inclusion and kindness, as it always does. Thankfully, we still have free speech in the United States, and the internet is exercising it actively amid the backlash to Sydney Sweeney starring in a denim ad for American Eagle that everyone is flipping out about online. For more on that, click here.